So the Big Ten is going to be wide open in 2024 for a multitude of reasons. There are four new members. One of them played in the national championship game last year. The other probably could have if they ever could have beat the team that played in the national championship. Another school is coming off a bad season, but had the Heisman Trophy winner the year before that. And then there's UCLA. But then also you return a team like Ohio State, who has national championship aspirations, that have went out and spent millions in NIL. Michigan is coming off winning a national championship. Penn State is ranked in the top 10 in the country to start the season and has who many believe might be a first-round NFL draft pick playing quarterback. So there are all of that coupled with the fact that there's no more divisions. There is no more East versus West. There is no more Indiana is going to play Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan State every season. So some schools benefit from a completely new schedule where Maryland, for instance, doesn't have those same schools Indiana has on their schedule every single year, where it's almost, for better or worse, guaranteed 4 losses every season, or at best case scenario, you're going to go 2-2 in that stretch. They just don't have that anymore. So the Big Ten is wide open going into 2024 in projecting who is or isn't, one, a title contender, but then two, going to play for the conference championship, because you don't have that straight line cutting the Big Ten in half geographically. It makes for interesting conversations about who is and isn't a possibility to play in Indianapolis in December. So on today's episode of the show, we're going to go through and go school by school, which game is the most important game on each school schedule. Now, not the toughest, because that would be a pretty boring episode of sitting here talking about how Rutgers is going to have a rough one against Michigan, or Michigan is going to have a tough one against Ohio State, or Oregon's going to play Washington, whatever the case may be. We're not talking toughest, because we talk about 3 or 4 schools. The most important game in each school schedule, and I'll tell you why I think that's the most important game in each school schedule. We'll go alphabetically. First with Illinois. I think Illinois' most difficult game is against Michigan State. And the reason that is because I think Illinois is going to be close on bowl eligibility in 2024. And I think this is the game that could decide it. I think when you look at how many games are truly winnable for each Big Ten school, there are some, like, you have a pretty good feeling that, like, this school is not going to have an issue getting to 6 wins. Or that school, like, for instance, I don't think Purdue has a path to 6 wins. But Illinois does. And this is the game that could decide it. Also, it comes off a bye for Illinois. So they have an extra week to prepare for Michigan State. And I also think it could play somewhat of a role in Brett Bielema's future at Illinois. If you look at where I think Brett Bielema sits, I don't know how hot his seat is going into 2024, but I think when you look at their schedule and go, okay, they play at Nebraska and at Penn State, their first 2 Big Ten games. That's rough. They also play Michigan and at Oregon. So they didn't get really any help from the schedule makers. But Saturday, November 16th at Michigan, or against Michigan State, is coming off a bye. And then their last 3 games are Michigan State at Rutgers versus Northwestern at Wrigley Field. Those are 3 winnable games for Illinois. You go through the schedule before that, like I said, they play a non-conference game against Kansas, which they're probably going to lose, at Nebraska, at Penn State, Purdue, Michigan, at Oregon, Minnesota. It's a somewhat difficult stretch there. So you can end the season somewhat strong and a win against Michigan State, in my opinion, will do that. For Indiana, I think Purdue is their biggest game, because just like Illinois, I think for Indiana, bowl eligibility is a possibility in Curt Cignetti's first season. but I don't think it's possible without a win over Purdue. Secondly, it's a rivalry game, right? Like it is one of those, like, if we went 1-11, but we beat Purdue, it was a successful season type deal. And I don't know what the expectations for Indiana are going to be in that first season for Curt Cignetti. But I know that one of the goals is going to be beat Purdue. And I don't speak highly of the 2024 Boilermakers. And so I think when you are looking at limited opportunities for wins, you have to get them where you can. And that's going to be a somewhat recurring theme for some schools in this list is when you can get them, you got to get them. And I think for Indiana, the game against Purdue to end the season is going to be one of those chances. Also, I think it helps and a first season of Curt Cignetti's, even if they don't make it to a bowl game, if they can end the season with a win, especially one over a rival, I think that is a good thing to head into the off season for the Hoosiers. For Iowa, I have their game at Minnesota as the most important game for the Hawkeyes in 2024. And I'm going to put Iowa, and this is probably like famous last words territory, I'm going to put Iowa in that same category that I've got Miami, where Miami could be a playoff contender in 2024, not because I think that they're really good, but because their schedule is so bad that I don't know how you don't win 10 games for Iowa. It's conceivable to me that they start the season 4-0. If they beat Minnesota at Minnesota, they start the season 4-0. They're playing Illinois State, Iowa State, Troy is their non-conference, then at Minnesota. So it's an important game to win because, one, it leads into a bye week, and then they play Ohio State after that bye week. So starting 4-0 is going to be really important for Iowa. But I think that they are not necessarily great, not necessarily even very good, but a college football playoff contender because their schedule is so ungood. They play at Ohio State, and that's pretty much it in the games that are like, they're probably going to lose. Now, they'll probably lose to somebody they have no business losing to, but they don't play Michigan. They don't play Penn State. They don't play Oregon. They have Wisconsin at home. They have Nebraska at home. They have Washington at home. The schedule makers did Iowa a really big play. Iowa State at home. Their road games are at Ohio State, at Michigan State, at UCLA, at Maryland. Iowa, their schedule sets up really nicely to conceivably be 11-1 with a loss to, unless the wheels come off for Ohio State, and 10-2, 11-1, 12-0 Ohio State. So the Minnesota game, should they win on the road at Minnesota, sets them up 4-0 start, conceivably, bye week at Ohio State. They have an opportunity to put some things together there. So I think that Iowa game at Minnesota is a really big deal. Also spoke about Maryland. And Maryland is somewhat in a similar boat to Iowa. It is not unreasonable to think that Maryland can start the season 6-0. They have UConn, Michigan State, at Virginia, Villanova, at Indiana, Northwestern. The bye week between Indiana and Northwestern. Which game in that schedule makes you think, I don't know that Maryland's going to win that one? Your non-conference is UConn, at Virginia, Villanova. An FBS independent, maybe the worst Power 4 team in Virginia, and an FCS school in Villanova, coupled with Michigan State in week number 2, who's probably not going to be necessarily rolling in week 2, and at Indiana to end September, a bye week, then Northwestern on a Friday night at home. Maryland starting the season 6-0 is not out of the realm of possibility by any stretch of the imagination. So that USC game, if they are 6-0, where they played Northwestern at home on a Friday night the week before, so you have a little extra time. You're not traveling back from Northwestern. You're home for Northwestern, and then you're playing USC at home. Maryland, against USC is set up to be the Terps being undefeated at home against a team making a 3-time zone travel. It's a big deal. Now, Maryland at the back half of the season did not get help from the schedule makers. They're after a bye week. They're at Oregon, Rutgers, Iowa, at Penn State. So similarly to Indiana and Illinois, you got to win them when you can get them. And I think a win over USC is the difference between Maryland winning 9 games or 8 games, or 8 games or 7 games. It's that big. If you can win, and any time a program like Maryland can win a game against a program like USC, no matter what USC is in 2024, it's going to be a big deal. But when that deal is the difference between being 7-5 or 8-4, or 8-4 and 9-3, it gets highlighted that much more. And so I think for Maryland, it's a big, big, big deal, especially if they're 6-0 going in to that game. Now for Michigan, we talked about the schedule makers. Michigan has it as difficult as anyone. As we sit here, they play 3 of the top 5 programs in the preseason top 25. 3 of the top 5. And when you look at the odds, 1, to make the college football playoff, but then 2, to win the national championship, they play 3 of some of the top bettors in America. So obviously it's going to come from Texas, Oregon, or at Ohio State, their most important game. I chose the Oregon game, and there are a couple reasons. 1, I think Michigan's going to take some time to find themselves. They lost a ton from last year's team, including their head coach. Get a new head coach who obviously comes from within the program, and they're going to be familiar with him, his terminology, how he wants to operate. He's going to be familiar with the personnel that they have, but I think they're going to start somewhat slow. And their somewhat slow start isn't necessarily, like they're not going to go 0-3 out of the gate. They play Fresno State at home, then they play Texas, who is going to be one of the best teams in America, and then Arkansas State. And so while I think that Texas game is really important, because if you can get a win at home against Texas, who has national championship aspirations, that means Michigan's going to be pretty good again in 2024. I don't know how good they're going to be. And that's not to, they won the national championship. It's just you lose so much from last year's squad that I think it's just going to take some time game-wise to figure out who they are and what they are. And so it's better suited for Oregon the first Saturday in November, in my opinion, at home, to have a shot to win one of those 3 games, because they can lose 2 of those 3 games between Texas, Oregon, and Ohio State and probably still make the college football playoff, I think. Because if you can point to, hey, our 2 losses are against teams in the top 10 or against teams in the top 5 or against teams in the top 2, you have a pretty strong case. Now, their schedule outside of that doesn't build for a lot of resume builders unless Arkansas State, Fresno State win their conferences, unless Washington is maybe a little bit better than I expect them to be, or Michigan State surprises some folks, whatever the case may be. If they can go 1-2 in those 3 games, which is a tall ask, no matter who or what the program, like just playing 3 schools that are ranked in the top 5 to begin with is a tall task. But if they can win one of them, and I know that it's easy to say Ohio State for Michigan, Ohio State is the answer, for Ohio State, Michigan is the answer, but I think you can look past that just because of where that game falls in the schedule, because you don't get the opportunity to make that back up, whoever loses that game. But if you can win a game against Oregon at home on a Saturday in early November, it goes a long way in helping you make the college football playoff. And so I think that's the best chance for Michigan to win one of those 3 games. And so that's why I've got Oregon as Michigan's biggest game in 2024. Now, for Michigan State, I think the Iowa game in mid-October is really, really, really important because it comes at a tough stretch In a 5-week stretch, Michigan State has Ohio State, at Oregon, a bye week, Iowa, at Michigan. So you talk about Michigan's schedule being really difficult there by playing 3 of the top 5 teams in America throughout the season. Michigan State has a 4-week stretch where I would guess by that point of the season, Iowa is undoubtedly ranked in the top 25. I would maybe even go as far to say they might be in the 15 to 20 range at that point. So you face what is right now number 2 Ohio State, number 3 Oregon, a top 25 Iowa, and what is right now 13 Michigan, at Oregon, at Michigan. That is a tough stretch in the middle of the season. Some of the best teams in America might go 1-3 in that stretch, and Michigan State is not going to be one of the best teams in America. So going 0-4 in that stretch, or maybe more importantly, not going 0-4 in that stretch, is going to be really important. And I think that's the most winnable of those 4 games. Now, the Michigan game, you can argue that, like, when these 2 rivals get together, you throw out the record books. I don't know that Michigan State is going to be that level with Michigan in the first year under Jonathan Smith to make that argument. But you get a home game against Iowa. Depending on what Iowa is offensively, especially at that point in the season, I think that's a winnable game for Michigan State. And I think somewhat it's one of those situations where you got to get every win you can. And I'm in that. I think Michigan State can be bowl eligible. I think they can be bowl eligible even without beating Iowa. But it's the difference between playing a 6-6 bowl game or 7-5 bowl game in the first year under a new head coach. For Minnesota, I have Rutgers. And Minnesota always seems to be somewhat of an anomaly in the Big Ten. Like the years that you think they might be pretty good is the year they stink. And the year you think, I think their over-under is like 5.5 for wins. And so there's not a ton of expectations at Minnesota. And even kind of their schedule is just like, it's not super difficult. They do play Penn State. They play at Michigan. So there's probably 2 losses right off the get-go. Their non-conference is North Carolina on a Thursday night, Rhode Island, and Nevada. So at worst, 2-1 in that stretch. But they play Rutgers before a bye week in November. And they have a bye week in October and then a 3-game stretch where it's Maryland, at Illinois, at Rutgers, and then another bye week. Their last 2 games are Penn State and at Wisconsin. So you might be able to say, like, hey, playing Rutgers at Rutgers for Minnesota might be the last chance that they get for a win in the season. And I think Rutgers and Minnesota are going to be somewhat close in talent, in expectations, in what they view 2024 is possible. Minnesota, if the over-under is 5.5, I think that's what I'm remembering correctly. If you can get to a bowl game, that's a good season for you. And Rutgers, I think the over-under was 7.5. So you're somewhat right there in that same boat of like, okay, who is going to get over that hump and get into a bowl game? And so Minnesota at Rutgers is not going to be on anybody's radar as like, I got to watch this on Saturday. Like, it's not, and I don't know that it ever will be. But it's a nice litmus test going into a bye week before you have 2 relatively difficult games to end the season for Minnesota. And so I think that that's a big game for Minnesota nearing the end of the season. And it's the exact opposite for Nebraska. The second week of the season, they play Colorado at home in front of a national TV audience in prime time. Former rival in the Big 12. There's a really big chance Nebraska starts the season 7-0, but they got to beat Colorado to do it. And I don't want to say that their season hinges on one game. I don't want to say anybody's season hinges on one game. But if they win that game, I think it's really likely that they start 7-0 before they travel to Ohio State at the end of October. And if you could start 7-0 at Nebraska, where they have not had palpable success since Bo Pelini left, or I guess since they fired Bo Pelini, Starting 7-0, things are going really well for Nebraska on the recruiting trail. If you can start 7-0, I think you can stay hot. You can build that momentum. And after Ohio State, their schedule is not super difficult either. So they start with UTEP, then Colorado. And I think Colorado is going to be better in 2024, especially to start the season. I just don't know that they're going to be good enough to go to Lincoln and get a win. So UTEP, Colorado, Northern Iowa. Not exactly the murderer's row in the non-conference slate. Then Illinois at Purdue, Rutgers at Indiana. If you see a loss in those 7 games, where is it? It's against Colorado at home, 7:30. The Cornhusker fans are going to be jacked up, excited as all get out because Deion Sanders, Shedeur Sanders, Travis Hunter are not going to be quiet about their excitement and how they feel about Nebraska coming into that game. So there's going to be extra cannon fodder. It's a former rival. Those used to be big-time games in the Big 12. And so it's going to bring a little extra juice. And if you can start the season 2-0, I think Nebraska starts the season 7-0. And if Nebraska starts the season 7-0, I think there's a chance Nebraska finishes the season at 10-2. Because after they play Ohio State, which is their, in theory, 7-0, it's UCLA at USC, Wisconsin at Iowa with a bye week thrown in there. At Iowa on Black Friday is the second most difficult game on Nebraska's schedule. It's not unrealistic to think that they're 10-2. But you've got to beat Colorado to do it. And if they don't, they start 1-1. Then there are questions of like, okay, if you couldn't beat Colorado, does that mean you're not going to beat USC? You're not going to beat Wisconsin. You're not going to beat Iowa. What could be 7-0 and turn into 10-2 if you start 1-1 could turn into 8-4. And that's a big drop off. And so I'm really interested to watch Nebraska to start the season because I think they're in that same boat of Iowa, of Miami, that they're not necessarily going to be really good as much as the schedule is less than good. And it opens them up to maybe artificially being a part of that college football playoff conversation late into the season. But you have to beat Colorado to do it. For Northwestern, I picked the Purdue game. And it's the first Saturday in November. And I wholeheartedly understand it. We're talking about bowl eligibility a lot in this episode. But in Northwestern's case, it's true. For other schools, it's like, well, the path to eligibility is difficult if they don't win this game. For Northwestern, if they can't beat Purdue, they do not have a path to winning 6 games. And it's the most important in my view because it's the end of a 5-game stretch that includes Maryland, Wisconsin, and at Iowa. So you're probably coming off 3 straight losses if you're Northwestern, maybe 4 when they start that 5-game stretch with Indiana. So you might be coming off 4 straight losses. And also it goes into a bye week after you play Purdue. Purdue's not going to be very good. So all of those things put together, like, are you 0-4 in that stretch and then you play Purdue? Because 0-4, if that turns into 0-5, the next 2 games are against Ohio State at Wrigley Field and at Michigan, which quickly turns into 0-6 in that stretch. 0-7 in that stretch if you don't beat Purdue. And so, like I've said, you got to win them when you can. Northwestern is firmly in that camp when it comes to playing Purdue. Now, we got to Ohio State. And I know that there are going to be people that it is absolutely 100% Michigan. But I think there are games before you get to Michigan that Ohio State has to check off the list first. Because if they are 11-0 when they go to play Michigan, then yes, the Michigan game 100% is the biggest game of the season. But Ohio State, I think in 2024 is in full out check them off the list because the expectations are going to be in no particular order. Perfection, which means you beat Michigan, which means you win the conference championship, which means you win the college football playoff semifinal, which means you win the college football national championship. And the only way to do that, and I know this is cliche and it's basic as all get out, but you just have to check them off week by week by week. But there is one game that is more important than the rest, and in my opinion, more important than the Michigan game, because so much of the season hinges on the Michigan game. You have to be perfect going into that game. Otherwise, it doesn't matter a whole lot. I mean, it matters, don't get me wrong. But in the grand scheme of things, in the 2024 season, looking at it from a 1,000-foot view, it doesn't mean a whole lot unless you're perfect going into that game. So I have Ohio State at Oregon on Saturday, October 12th, which is one of like 8 games. It's going to be phenomenal that Saturday. Can't wait for Saturday, October 12th, because it's going to be awesome. But for all intents and purposes, Ohio State has 3 really difficult games. You could maybe argue 4 if Nebraska is not a pretender at 7-0 after they play Oregon. But they have 3 really difficult games. And I guess not even, maybe you can view them as really difficult games. 3 really important games. They play at Oregon, at Penn State, and Michigan. And I think the Oregon game is a big one because first, 2 of them are on the road, right? You have 3 difficult games, 2 of them you got to go there, which is never great. Oregon is an especially difficult place to play. One, their fans are psychos, right? They're just nuts. They love 2 things, rain and the Oregon Ducks. It's a weird combo. Eugene is not an easy place to get to if you're flying. Now, it's a little easier when you're flying private, but it's a difficult place to play, difficult place to go, and you're moving 3 time zones. And Oregon's going to be good. And if you lose that game, you still have a chance to rebound and still win 10 games. But if you lose that game, the knock against Ryan Day is that he doesn't win big games. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think generally it's fair of anybody that you throw that moniker to, because it's only used after losses. Nobody win, like anytime somebody wins a big game, you will then see somebody else argue that that's not a big game. Like Ohio State has beaten Penn State when Penn State's ranked in the top 5. Ohio State under Ryan Day has won a Big Ten championship. They've beaten Michigan. They won a college football playoff semifinal. Like if you play in the national championship game, you undoubtedly have won big games. So to say that like, oh, all he does is lose big games is malarkey, poppycock, balderdash, other words that insinuate bullshit. It's ridiculous. But if that is the perception, you cannot lose to Oregon on Saturday, October 12th, because it has the possibility to be a 1 versus 2, or at minimum, like a top 5 matchup. At worst, probably a top 10 matchup. And if you lose that game, the perception is going to remain that you don't win big games. And you don't want that to fester in 2024 before you get to the Michigan game. If you have already lost a game, whether it's at Oregon, whether it's at Penn State, and you're going to play Michigan later in the season, the Saturday after Thanksgiving, and you've already lost one of those quote-unquote big games, it's not a good spot to be in. And so while the Michigan game obviously, undoubtedly is the game that everybody, for Ohio State fans, Michigan fans, and college football fans in general, will circle, I think the Oregon game is a really important one for Ohio State. And on the flip side, for Oregon, that Ohio State game is the most important one for a lot of the same reasons. Oregon has 2 really difficult games in 2024. They're home for Ohio State, and they travel to Michigan. The Ohio State game is the first real Big Ten game, the first big-time Big Ten game. So the crowd's going to be pumped. It very well could be top 5 matchup. It's going to be one of the biggest regular season games of the season. If Oregon can win against Ohio State at home, they're probably starting 8-0, and they're going to control their own destiny at that point of playing in the Big Ten championship game and ultimately playing for the college football playoff. So it's a big game on both sides. Now, on the flip side of or I guess speaking of Ohio State, for Penn State, Ohio State is going to be their biggest game. It's Saturday, November 2nd. And I've talked before about how I think Penn State is one of the really few teams in college football who benefits from an expanded college football playoff. Teams like Penn State, Ole Miss are in that category of being one of the 4 best teams was going to be a really difficult task. Being one of the 12 best teams is going to be pretty easy for Penn State, Ole Miss, Miami, other Auburn, some of those schools from time to time. And we talked about how the schedule is pretty kind to Nebraska, pretty kind to Iowa. The schedule is not kind to Penn State. Or I guess, let me rephrase that. The schedule is not kind to Penn State outside of Ohio State, in the fact that they're not going to have a ton of opportunities to pad their resume. They don't play Michigan. They don't play Oregon. They play Ohio State at home, but they don't have a real great resume booster outside of playing Ohio State at home. If they can win at West Virginia or at USC, Wisconsin, that can be impressive-ish, depending on what those schools do. But the one game that they control is Ohio State at home. And it's really going to be their one opportunity to put on a show for the College Football Playoff Committee, for college football fans in general. If you're going to watch, if you live in Birmingham, the one Ohio State or Penn State game you might watch is the game against those two play each other the first Saturday in November. And so you get one crack at it. And it pretty much boils down to that. If you lose any other time, you're not going to get the chance to play in a college football playoff. If you win, you likely have punched your ticket to the college football playoff. So the season kind of literally hinges on one game for Penn State. You get the opportunity, you got to make the best of it. Now we get to Purdue. We've not been super kind to Purdue. And it's nothing that the Boilermakers have done. It's just they're not going to be very good in 2024. So the biggest game for Purdue, in my estimation, is at Illinois. And it is in the stretch of a really difficult stretch for Purdue. They have a bye week in week 2. A little early. Schedule maker does not like the Boilermakers. Week 3 is Notre Dame. Week 4 is at Oregon State. Week 5 is Nebraska. Week 6 is at Wisconsin. Week 7 is at Illinois. Week 8 is Oregon. So, Penn State has a pretty easy schedule. Purdue gets the opposite. You get that run there where, even in the non-conference, you're playing Notre Dame and at Oregon State, which I don't know. I feel great. Like I've said it before on this podcast. I feel confident that Purdue can win one game in 2024, the opener against Indiana State. After that, I don't know where you look at their schedule and go like, yeah, they're going to win that. Now they can win, at Oregon State. They can win at Illinois, Northwestern, at Indiana. But will they? I don't know. And so Illinois feels like the second or third best chance for a win for Purdue in 2024. And as I've said, you gotta take them where you can get them. And I just don't know how many opportunities Purdue's going to have in 2024 to win games. And so at Illinois is a big one for Purdue. Somewhat on the exact opposite end of the spectrum is Rutgers, where Rutgers non-conference is bad. It's bad. They play an HBCU in Howard. They play what is quite possibly one of, if not the worst FBS schools in Akron, and they're at Virginia Tech after a bye week in their non-conference. So for Rutgers, I think their USC game is a really, really, really big game. It's the last game of October. It's the last game of 6 straight where they play at Virginia Tech, Washington, at Nebraska, Wisconsin, UCLA, and then at USC. This game is a Friday night game. It's going to start at 11 o'clock Eastern time, p.m. Going to be after a World Series game. So national audience on Fox after a World Series game. And somewhat similar to what we talked about with Maryland, where, if they can beat USC, that's a big time deal no matter who, when, where it comes. It's the same for Rutgers. It's the last of a 6-game stretch, a somewhat difficult six-game stretch. But if you can go to USC and get a win, it's big time. And I know that it feels wrong to say, but Rutgers could legitimately 100% be an 8 or 9 win team in 2024. They don't play Ohio State. They don't play Michigan. They don't play Penn State. They don't play Oregon. So the 4 kind of consensus, these are the top dogs in the conference. Rutgers plays none of them. Their Big Ten schedule is Washington at Nebraska, Wisconsin, UCLA at USC, Minnesota at Maryland, Illinois at Michigan State. It is not inconceivable that they win 8 or 9 games. But to do it, you got to beat USC. And you got to beat Wisconsin. You got to beat Maryland. You got to beat everybody that you can beat. And going on the road to USC is not an easy task. But if they can go in there with a little bit of confidence, it's not unrealistic. Now, for UCLA, I have them somewhat in that same boat as Purdue, where they're not going to be very good. And so I picked the game for UCLA against Minnesota. UCLA is going to have a tough first year in the Big Ten. You had a first-year head coach, got the job late, lost some talent to the NFL, and they play Minnesota after what is legitimately one of the tougher stretches in college football in 2024. They play at LSU, home for Oregon, and at Penn State. So 2 weeks, 2 out of 3 weeks, you are at 2 of the most hostile environments in college football, at LSU and at Penn State. And sandwiched between that is an Oregon squad who is ranked in the top 5 to start the country. Then they play Minnesota. So you've likely lost 3 in a row, maybe 4 in a row if you lost to Indiana to start that stretch. UCLA has to respond at some point. Like, you can't let a 3-game losing streak or a 4-game losing streak and then you lose to Minnesota, because then they play at Rutgers, at Nebraska, Iowa, at Washington, USC. In that stretch, what sounds like a win for UCLA? Minnesota. And so a loss to Minnesota unravels everything. A win can salvage a really tough stretch. But if they lose, that's tough. It's really, really tough because you're staring an 8-game losing streak right in the face. Now, for the crosstown rival in USC, I think their game at Michigan, it's early in the season. It's week 4. Now, USC doesn't have a great start. They play LSU in Las Vegas to start the season. Then they play Utah State, get a bye week at Michigan. The first ever Big Ten game USC is going to play is at the Big House in front of a national audience, the defending national champs. There's a good chance they're 1-1 at that stretch. I don't think Lincoln Riley's on the hot seat, but I think you could be asking some questions depending on how they play at Michigan coming off a bye week after conceivably losing to LSU to start the season. You come in there and lay an egg, people be asking questions. So the first ever USC Big Ten game is in a tough spot. I think they can figure it out, and I think they can play tough in that situation. They're going to have to. And the final 2 schools, Washington is at Iowa. Now, Washington's schedule sets up pretty nicely for them to start the season a little bit hot. Like, they can start 5-1. So I almost chose the Michigan game for Washington because they start, in my opinion, the season probably 5-1. Non-conference is pretty easy. FCS Weber State, Eastern Michigan, Washington State, then Northwestern at Rutgers before they play Michigan. Now they play Iowa after they play Michigan. And so it's the second time that they come east. They play at Rutgers, which is as far as you can get in college football, let alone the Big Ten. But I think coming off a game against Michigan that I would pick for them to lose, they're 5-1. And so how do you respond to that? Iowa likely to be coming off a loss to Ohio State for this game too. Somebody's going to right the ship. Somebody's going to start a losing streak. And if Washington's going to go on the road, grab a win over Iowa, that means good things are in store in the first year for Jed Fish and the Huskies. If they can't, it might be a tough year. It's not going to be a bad year, I don't think, for Washington. It didn't get a lot of help on the first year schedule in the Big Ten. They play Michigan. They play at Penn State, at Oregon. Now, they're going to play Oregon every year. They're going to play USC every year. So not a great help there. But I think if you can bounce back from a loss against Michigan, be 5-1, and beat Iowa, I think Washington's looking at a 8-4, 9-3. If they can't beat Iowa, 7-5 feels a lot more likely. And the final Big Ten team is Wisconsin. And Wisconsin has probably I don't even know if it's probably, I think Wisconsin has the second biggest non-conference game in the Big Ten this year. I think obviously Texas at Michigan is number one. Wisconsin is home for Alabama in week 3. And I hope and pray that there are more types of these games where Wisconsin is at Camp Randall for Alabama, where USC is at the Raider Stadium in Las Vegas for LSU. There have been other high-profile non-conference games at neutral sites. I want big-time games on campus stadiums. And so I like Alabama at Wisconsin. It's week 3. They've got 2 bad non-conference games to help prepare them. Western Michigan, South Dakota, before they play the Crimson Tide at home in a big noon kickoff. It also leads into a bye week. And after that bye week, they've got some winnable games. At USC, Purdue, at Rutgers, at Northwestern, Penn State, Iowa. So, it's kind of a measuring stick game for Wisconsin against Alabama. Now, I don't know that it's a winnable game, really, for Wisconsin. I mean, it is. It's a home game in a non-conference. But Alabama's still going to be really good despite Nick Saban retiring. But if you can stack some wins there where you go 3-0, I think you probably feel pretty good about going to USC and then Purdue, at Rutgers, at Northwestern. Just like we talked about Nebraska starting the season potentially 7-0 if they can beat Colorado in week 2. Wisconsin can start the season if they can beat Alabama. Who on their schedule makes you think they can't beat them? If you can beat Alabama, you're damn near likely to beat anybody. And so you don't have – I've talked a little bit about, having 2 games that are difficult, 3 games to really circle. Wisconsin has 3. Alabama at home, Penn State at home, Oregon at home. Camp Randall ain't a fun place to go and try to play, especially in prime time. Alabama's a noon game. But it's absolutely a measuring stick game. If you can beat Alabama, you're going to feel really good about 2024. And if Alabama beats your brakes in at home in front of a national TV audience, there are going to be some questions about Luke Fickell, about the program, about the Big Ten. And that's just one of those things that you're going to have to deal with by scheduling a game of this magnitude. So in my opinion, those are the most important games for each Big Ten school in 2024. Want to know what you think? Think I'm way off base? Think I missed a game that should be more crucial than I think it is? Let us know in the comments down below. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you are watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out. If you are listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. I'll see you tomorrow for another episode here of the Daily Huddle.